Maurice Cranston, 1920–1993, was an English philosopher, teacher, and author. He became known for his work as a professor of political science at the London School of Economics, as a professor of political theory at the European University Institute, Italy, and for all of his publications. In the context of the Second World War, he was a conscientious objector, refusing to serve in his country's army and contributing to the pacifist magazine Peace News. His greatest works include biographies of Locke, Rousseau, Sartre, among others who contributed to the history of freedom, in its most liberal sense. He contributed to several publications in England and the United States and wrote scripts for the BBC. Imaginary dialogue between Marx and Bakunin is one of Cranston's scripts written for the BBC in London, when, in October 1962, he imagined a dialogue between Marx and Bakunin, a conversation that these two men supposedly had during the meeting held in London, in November 3, 1864. In this interview, broadcast to millions of listeners, the author endeavored to reconstruct, based on the particular theses developed by the two thinkers in their respective works, a credible controversy, which reveals extraordinary erudition. In this short piece of writing, we find the two men who dominated their time on a social level, in the harsh debate on this eternally current topic: should we trust in freedom? Or, on the contrary, is authority indispensable? The text was published in December 1962 by the London magazine Anarchy and was later translated into several languages and published in different countries. Introduction. Because asking for power, which is vain and never achieved, and always suffering hard work to achieve it, is pushing hard towards the top of the mountain, a stone that, when it reaches the top, rolls down again and falls towards the top. Stop on the plain. Lucretius. From Rerum Natura, 3. In the second half of the 19th century, the colossal energies released by industrial capitalism had definitively changed the texture of the world, and no longer allowed naive palliatives. Stimulated by greed and the need for new markets and new sources of energy, the European universe of finance and business was preparing its military, economic, and spiritual assault on the rest of the globe, under the banner of civilization, material development, and progress. Narrowing the possibilities of the indeterminate, the unforeseen, the unquantified, the spontaneous, became the principle that would guide all planes of existence that gravitated around the disaggregated sphere of the economy, to which all human energies were consecrated, making that, even the imponderable, were subject to discipline. The foundations of capitalist modernity were already perfectly laid in the second half of the 19th century, a time of blessed faith in unlimited progress as the engine of a global process that would reach all spheres of human action and that would provide material and moral development with unlimited horizons. Man, according to philosophers and rationalists, was continually rising from the mire of superstition, ignorance, savagery, towards a world that would be increasingly educated, humane and rational. Unexpectedly, the last quarter of the century brought dark omens for human dreams of limitless power. From 1873 onwards, capitalism entered a self-destructive spiral and found itself immersed in a crisis of magnificent dimensions, which would only see its way out of the tunnel at the turn of the 20th century. The stock markets went into crisis, panic spread quickly, bankruptcies followed, companies sank, confidence in the markets became volatile, and the unrestricted faith in free market capitalism was placed in quarantine. But what seemed like a debacle was a simple turbulence that capitalism took advantage of to reinvent itself, preserving its principles intact. Economic liberalism entered a time of restructuring and readjustments that began to fundamentally tame the economic sphere and subject it to political purposes dictated by the state. European industrial ideas continued to follow the path opened by progress, a progress that, as 4's splendid Requiem proclaimed, would sweep away the mystery of the ways of the world. Having suppressed the mysteries, industrial capitalism accelerated the gigantic development of transport and communications infrastructures, favoring an increasing concentration of government apparatuses and the emergence of a massive bureaucracy, in charge of managing a world far removed from any reasonable human scale. The advance of industrial machinery had not only swept away an enormous amount of traditional knowledge and crafts, but had also wrested control of the work process from the hands of producers, elevating the factory, with its sordid despotism, to the level of a victorious company because it was the one that best adapted to capitalism. Capitalism was much more than a mode of production, it was a way of understanding the world that presupposed an unquestionable acceptance that man was an economic animal in perpetual struggle against nature, a creature driven solely by the stimulus of competition with his fellow men and by the blind greed for gain. However, the forging of this world landscape had not been a path without surprises or resistance. On the contrary, the stage reached by capitalism at the end of the 19th century was the result of a tough battle between capital in permanent search for increasing profits and the intransigent at times, epic opposition of organized workers. In its attempt to combat the rules of the game imposed by capital, the world of work had created its own universe, and it was from this intense creativity that new organizational forms and connections of thought emerged. However, in many cases, there was also, firmly rooted, a fatal ambiguity, the assumption that the path taken by capitalist industrialism contained, despite everything, an essential truth, although it must be modified through reforms or revolutions. Even starting from moral assumptions that could be markedly egalitarian in the political arena and equitable in the distribution of wealth, the labor movement remained, to a large extent, linked to the mental and material foundations on which the political economy had been built. Capitalism was brutal because it opened an abyss between classes and mercilessly exploited labor. The appropriation by workers of the means of production was, therefore, the only way to suppress this order of things, which distributed opulence among the few and misery for the immense majority. Organized workers were prey, with exceptions, to the disastrous illusion that means and ends could have an existence of their own, without internal coherence or an accurate sense of proportions. In other words, it would be enough to unleash the liberating possibilities of capitalist technology. The vast majority of thinkers aligned with the working class also believed in the possibility of changing the sign of technology by climbing the ladder of political and economic power to subject it to new purposes. However, he underestimated the abject obedience that the machine demanded from those who sought to control it, and did not notice that these tyrannical demands nullified, in its most basic foundations, any attempt to build a more horizontal and democratic world. There were also, on the contrary, those who intuited an unfriendly aspect of progress and science, accusing it of providing a rational alibi for the domination of man by man. For this segment of workers, man's extraordinary transformative capacity had provided immense progress in very valuable knowledge and very usable productivity. However, they had quickly found themselves contrasted by equally large increments of ostentatious waste, paranoid hostility, senseless destruction, and appalling disasters of extermination. Superscript 3. If these contingencies were part of the bill to be paid by humanity, for its project of achieving happiness, understood as material abundance, socialism built on these bases would be nothing more than the management of the permanent crisis, the state of emergency and moral misery. To a large extent, the history of the labor movement is the conflict between the adoption of the productivist creed of industrialism and its implications, and the determination and attempt to extricate oneself from it. In this sense, the figures of Marx and Bakunin exemplify these two opposite directions within the labor movement, a movement that, in the second half of the 19th century, undertook the adventure of uniting its forces on a common horizon. A rich kaleidoscope of ideas and episodes that slowly wove its different organizational models and trends, the European labor movement sought a point of convergence in 1864, a reference year in which these vectors were articulated around principles and proposals that could constitute a minimum program accordingly. This was how, in St. Martin's Hall, in the City of London, the International Workers' Association was founded, which would become known as the First International. Originally composed of British and French trade unionists, and Île-Ross workers from different parts of Europe, the International emerged as a space of union and solidarity between workers of different nationalities, and as a collective platform to develop strategies of struggle and new lines of combat against the oppression of capital. However, in addition to the objectives and achievements of the workers grouped within it, the International entered the annals of labor history as the landmark in which the decisive fracture occurred, at the 1872 Congress, between the followers of the trends exposed by Karl Marx, the which had been present since the founding of the International, and the followers of the trends exposed by Mikhail Bakunin, who had joined in 1868. The open personal and theoretical rivalry of these two figures who projected their own unique light in the universe of workers' struggles ended, finally, by dismembering the delicate union of the International, bifurcating the workers' movement into two main nuclei, Marxism and anarchism, distinct tendencies of socialism that showed substantial differences. Evaluating the nature of the differences that ended up distancing Marx and Bakunin and, consequently, imploding the First International, G.D.H. Cole established four determining factors for the rupture between them: personal struggles, the dispute over authoritarianism and centralization, the apoliticism and the controversial role of the state as an instrument of workers' power. It would not be audacious, however, to add another element, capital, for its multiple and decisive implications, which permeates Marx's work and which Bakunin firmly and without hesitation rejected: scientism derived from progressive evolutionism, which Marx always nurtured and which ultimately led him to elaborate a critique of capital, chained to the constitutive categories of capitalism itself, that is, economic rationality and unlimited material expansion. Let's look in more detail at these friction points and their effects. 1.1 Parallel universes, irreconcilable natures. The divergences between Marx and Bakunin were already evident, perhaps due to the natural order of things, even before the meeting, and the consequent clash, of their political ideas. A prodigious thinker, an indefatigable scholar, Marx had an abysmal intelligence. He had an extraordinary literary talent, a titanic capacity for work, a dazzling wit, an incisive sense of irony, as well as colossal theoretical resources, elements that did not hide a considerable presumption, an undisguised tendency towards personal control, even if in the shadows, and the constant search to occupy the apex of all the spaces in which it was installed. Bakunin, for his part, never hid his bad opinion of the world, and never missed a train bound for any barricade. Excessive spirit, unleashed Jupiter. Bakunin was the opposite of a nebulous orator or a moderate polemicist, a walking charisma capable of proposing toasts for the destruction of the social order and the unleashing of evil passions, whose presence was always a portent of storm. A self-confessed materialist, it is not difficult to imagine how complacently he would accept Virgil's maxim that the spirit moves matter. Two exceptional temperaments, Marx was, in his methodical rigor, lucid; Bakunin, in his prodigality, luminous, capable of radiating an overflowing enthusiasm around him. Marx intended to regiment and discipline the same passions that Bakunin wished to mobilize and exasperate. If Marx's work contained a high dose of abstraction, not always within the reach of the workers he intended to illustrate, requiring slow digestion, Bakunin's texts lacked both this thickness and systematizing purpose, but were transparent, round, and of good quality. Remarkable sense. While Marx constituted a theoretical lightning rod and fed progressive illusions, Bakunin stirred up disintegrative tendencies and annihilated all scientific fantasy. He coded his idea of happiness, in ascending order, in sleeping, eating, drinking, smoking, cultivating science and art, love and friendship, and, as the supreme act of happiness, he gave the highest importance to dying fighting for freedom. Unable to escape some senseless proclamations of his romantic time, such as giving his life in a last heroic act, Bakunin lived as he felt, did not leave an embarrassing territory between theory and practice, and vehemently believed that one cannot be revolutionary without love, above all, life. This motto was not always a reliable guide to his physical integrity, and on more than one occasion it placed him on the brink of the abyss, even making him flirt with the scaffold. In fact, he purged his determination with long years of prison and exile. He never regretted it. He knew well that opting for revolution was choosing a hellish job. Despite the debatable, and even marginal, interest that psychological portraits have in historical effects, the truth is that the personal profiles of these two powerful political animals go far beyond mere anecdote, since their temperaments accurately symbolize the set of their theories. Their disagreements, which culminated in the open fracture that caused rivers of ink to flow, were recorded by history as the incarnation of the dispute between two ways of understanding the workers' struggle and organization, but also as different ways of engineering existence, of affirmation in the face of life. It is for this reason that their dispute transcended the time in which it was carried out to become the subject of a timeless controversy. In any case, from a historical point of view, Cranston was able to get Marx and Bakunin to share the kettle and exchange pleasant criticisms in 1864, without too many concessions to literature, because, in fact, the meeting took place. On November 3, 1864, Bakunin, in London, after the epic escape from captivity in Siberia, received a visit from Karl Marx. Bakunin himself recalls the atmosphere of forced cordiality and latent distrust that reigned on that occasion. Marx swore to me that he had never done or said anything against me, that, on the contrary, he had always had sincere friendship and a great appreciation. I knew that what I said was absolutely not true, but the truth is that I didn't hold any grudge against him. The satisfactions that Marx offered on that occasion were intended to close the cloudy subject of Bakunin's defamation that his newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung of Cologne, had propagated on July 6, 1848. Echoing a rumor attributed to George Sand, the newspaper assured that Bakunin was, in reality, a Russian agent, a statement that George Sand would later vehemently deny, calling it a gratuitous and hateful invention. Marx rectified it, but the shadow of fear and skepticism never stopped hovering between them. Bakunin knew well that it would have been illusory to expect Marx to treat him like a porcelain cup, and that night in 1864, remembers the Russian, they said goodbye outwardly converted into very good friends, but I did not return the visit. With all protocol formalities gone, in 1870 Marx had no qualms about asserting that Bakunin had paid with disloyalty and treachery for the generous economic assistance provided to him by the brilliant Russian ebooks Alexander Herzen, accusing him, biliously, of having taken over part of the inheritance of the latter. In September 1872, at the Hague Congress, Bakunin was expelled from the International, 27 votes in favor and 6 against, largely thanks to the pressure exerted by Marx and Engels. Gone are the times when Bakunin spoke of Mr. Marx as the illustrious head of German communism, and when Marx confessed to Engels, after the meeting in 1864, his intimate satisfaction at having met him, 16 years later, with very advanced ideas. Doing good to the enemy can be a work of justice, Borges said, but loving him is the task of angels and not men. With love excluded, since the sky was empty, Marx, in 1872, gave reliable proof that he also did not believe in certain works of justice. 1.2 Industria Imperatrix Mundi, Marx and the Temptation of Totality. The admiration that Karl Marx professed for Hegel was never a secret, nor the fact that his theory had a reference of primary importance in Hegel's work. Hegel understood history as a continuous and unstoppable advance of the spirit, that is, of reason, until, through a game of dialectical oppositions, appearance did not contradict itself with essence, and reason inaugurated its government without obstacles. The set of circumstances that made up existence could move in a variable direction, but without ever compromising its destiny, the universal government of reason. This immense mass of wills, interests, and activities are the instruments and means that the universal spirit uses to fulfill its purpose, to raise it to consciousness and realize it. Despite some brilliant flashes, one in which he manages to free himself from the Enlightenment ballast, Marx's work is saturated with paragraphs in which Hegel's work is perfectly perceptible. For example, in the well-known lines of his prologue to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx states that the productive forces that develop within bourgeois society at the same time create the material conditions for resolving this contradiction. With this social organization, the prehistory of human society ends. In other words, Marx claimed for the productive forces the role that Hegel had attributed to the spirit as the driving force of history. His professed intention was to turn the Hegelian scheme upside down, but without replacing or altering its internal components. It is evident that Hegel takes the right path in the opposite direction, stated Marx in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of direct. But the problem lay not in the meaning, but in the path itself. This brilliant trick of sleight of hand, this revolving door of logic, could not offer, operating with the same factors, an original result. Changing the order of the elements was like turning an hourglass, the structure rests on a different base, but the sand always slides in the same direction. If for Hegel history pursued an end, codified within it, which was progressively gestated in the development of reason, Marx incarnated this Hegelian reason in progress and industry, guiding principles whose impetus advanced history, moving it away from the primitive stages of a defenseless humanity exposed to the rigors of nature. In fact, in Marx, man's status is based on his conquest of nature, it is his destiny. But it is only with the full development of science and technology, with the intoxication of power provided by industry, that this status crystallizes, burying a past of impotence that condemned man to a merely symbolic struggle with the sensitive environment. For him, as before for Hegel, man will only find the path to his human fulfillment by denying nature. This argument, which sometimes appears dampened, pursued a goal, to put an end to a world whose ignorance of industry does not allow it to overcome the alienation of the struggle for existence, that is, to end the prehistory of human society. But this metaphysics of productive forces was precisely the axis on which capitalist modernity revolved. If anyone sets out to establish and extend the power and dominion of the human race over the universe, stated Bacon, his ambition, if it may be called that, would, without a doubt, be the wisest and noblest of all. This summarizes the program of modernity: liquidate all organic relationships with the environment, be owners and masters of nature Descartes, and conquer it through technique. It was big industry that in fact created world history, completed the victory of the commercial city over the countryside, a territory of superstition and reactionary atavisms. With industry crowned as Imperatrix Mundi, Emperor of the world, nothing prevented granting industrial work the credential of the only instrument capable of deforesting men's path towards freedom. These basic certainties inevitably determine the set of Marxist theory on politics and the social mechanics of change, on revolution. Thus, in a lacerating paragraph on imperialism, Marx enters without blush into the terrain of ambushed reason. England, it is true, in causing a social revolution in Hindustan was moved by the vilest interests and was stupid in the way she imposed them. But that's not what this is about. The question is, can humanity fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia? If not, whatever may have been England's crimes, she was the unconscious instrument of history in bringing about this revolution. The interests were vile and the way of imposing them stupid, but humanity had to fulfill its mission. The atrocities committed by imperialism were severely criticized by Marx, but these misfortunes were part of a bitter necessity and, as such, should be integrated into the chapter of inevitable fatalities. Exporting the industrial gospel to people who ignored it was equivalent to rescuing them from their backwardness and guaranteeing the realization of their destiny in an indeterminate future. The corollary of industrial expansion might be tragic and merciless, but it was non-negotiable. What is certain is that Marx never explained why this development constituted the only path to the liberation of men, even if it cruelly crushed them temporarily. This postulate has in Marx, and in the Marxist literature inspired by him, a more assertive than demonstrative character and implies begging the question, an inevitable consequence of his habit of extracting consequences from premises. Deploring the terrifying consequences of industrialism, which Marx and Engels knew in detail, was a very human reaction that could not go beyond the limits of the moral plane, since opposing the advancement of industry and productivist reason was, ultimately, blocking the path to socialism. Progress was a liberating power until it reached a point of no return, after which it changed signs to become oppressive. Revolutions would cut this knot, freeing, not men, but productive forces to continue advancing in their mission. Point 2. And as a result, and despite the damage occasionally caused, spurring the expansion of industrialism was the only path to revolution. This approach had consequences that went beyond mere philosophical speculations. It constituted a general plan for social life, but also a program for accelerating the process of political struggle that led to a classless society. Through his central role in the industrial system, Marx transferred to the working class the privilege of putting an end to the world created by the bourgeoisie and giving way to his utopia of a classless society. Consequently, Marx excluded the peasants from this commitment. Therefore, what revolutionary role could they play, if they were incapable of asserting their class interest in their own name, if they could not represent themselves, having to be represented? What if, on top of that, this representative had to appear as their lord, as authority over them? Student stupidity. Marx roared against bakunin. A radical social revolution is linked to certain historical conditions of economic development, the latter are its presupposition. Therefore, it is only possible where, with capitalist production, the industrial proletariat occupies at least a significant position. Consequently, the revolution would be, according to this scheme, a direct result of the development of the productive forces, and would be piloted by the industrial proletariat, designated historically and objectively to lead it. Later, Lenin would take this theory that privileges the working class as a revolutionary subject to its level of incandescence, that is, to the level of the most ruthless authoritarianism and the most fierce centralization, outlining the contours of the party as a vanguard. Marx left, on the other hand, few descriptions of the general picture of the post-revolutionary world. However, in his work, we find utopian undertones only highlighted by almost clandestine readings among his commentators. In any case, they exist and are not to be ignored. In the critique of the Gotha program, Marx alludes to a higher phase of communist society, when the slave subordination of individuals to the division of labor and, with it, the antagonisms between manual labor and intellectual labor have disappeared, when work has become not only a way of life, but also the first necessity of existence. Here, the scientific pretension evaporates, we find ourselves in the territory of utopia. Didn't Marx punish, for much less, those bourgeois socialists who exhorted the proletariat to enter the New Jerusalem? This idyllic future, the result of the consummation of a process of overwhelming material advancement that Marx imagined, was not far from William Morris' Arcadia, although, for the permanent consultants of the sacred word, this judgment of the master's mistakes was nothing more than an evil mockery of the bourgeoisie. Lenin. Enlightenment version of Providence, designating progress 3 and the development of technology as levers that moved the world, implied admitting the existence of an internal purpose in history, a purpose that could be inferred through reason. However, this general scheme left many cables loose. What philosophical foundation establishes that productive forces have a natural tendency to develop? What would be the criteria used to measure the critical point from which the development of productive forces would wipe the bourgeoisie from the face of the earth through a social revolution? What authorized the statement that the anatomy of civil society must be sought in political economy? Why is the conflict between the development of the forces of production and the mode of production not precisely born in the head of man, but has its roots in facts, in objective reality, outside of us, independently of will or activity of the very men who provoked it? When Marx and Engels rightly accused Hegel of idealism, did they not similarly succumb to the Aristotelian seduction of thinking that essence is the object of study, because we seek the principles and causes of essences? Should history be written according to a norm located outside of itself? Where would this place reside outside of history, the secret home of the invisible powers wild? Did Hegel's system and its magical determination to break down the doors, behind which the ultimate essences of social mechanics were hidden, truly constitute, as Engels claimed, the last gigantic abortion of its kind? To what extent has Marxism not followed the same path? Marx's propensity for dualism meant that his work could not be surrounded by a narrow circle of chalk, an exception to the most laughable orthodoxy, and which even today makes many of his main postulates objects of discussion and controversy. It is these cracks of ambiguity, which run through his theoretical edifice, that were taken advantage of by a large number of Marxist exegetes, theologians always available to reinterpret and find new angles of analysis of Marx's work. Some were, without a doubt, extraordinarily intelligent and talented, but they were unable to save capital elements in Marx from the fire, such as the teleological idea of a historical task of the proletariat, the providential meaning attributed to history, the categorization of industry as theodicy, or the metaphysical belief in a higher stage of communism. What is certain is that a doctrine, as the Church Fathers well illustrated, can achieve surprising elasticity and admit as many interpretations as hermeneutics. It is, however, the same concept of doctrine that should be questioned, even more so if it is built on the foundations of progress and the unlimited expansion of reason. No family of Marxism can question these foundations without radically transfiguring the physiognomy of Marx's work. As Simone Weil recalled, for the oppressed and exploited, even in moments of defeat and bitter repression, knowing that they belong to a class destined to inherit the world and that the destiny embodied in a providential history concerned them, was already something. It was enough to unleash the demons hidden within the productive forces to enter paradise. That all this has been cruelly contradicted by history itself, for many, is just an unimportant question. 1.3 Bakunin and Progress as Phantasmagoria. Much less gifted at theoretical systematization than Marx, we find in Bakunin's fragmentary work conjectures of a very different sign to those of the German philosopher about nature, progress, and technology. Firstly, Bakunin contemplated two meanings of nature, one that encompassed the set of existing things, and which obviously included human beings, and a second that included only the sensitive environment, in Marx's terms. Against the latter, man had to display ingenuity, courage, and determination, since otherwise he would not have completed the process of hominization. Waging an unrelenting war against the former constituted an unreasonable and reckless project, since no one can rebel against nature without immediately reaching the point of absurdity or without causing their own destruction. Secondly, and analogously to Marx, Bakunin firmly believed in the centrality of work in social life. Now, what substantially differentiated his vision from Marxist industrialism is that this work did not have as its objective the conquest of nature. When man acts on nature, it is in reality nature that works on itself. And we can clearly see that rebellion against nature is impossible. As a result, man will never be able to fight nature, he can neither conquer nor dominate her. When man undertakes acts that are apparently hostile to nature, he once again obeys the laws of that same nature. Nothing can free him from his hold, he is his unconditional slave. But this does not constitute slavery at all, since every type of slavery presupposes the existence of two individuals, one on the other's side, and the submission of one to the other. As man is part of nature and not something external to it, it is impossible for him to be a slave to it. Bakunin had no greater enthusiasm for science and progress as creators of an abundance that would lead to the realm of happiness. On the contrary, he stated that there are unsurpassable cognitive limits for man, and that he will never be able to understand everything nor achieve the dream of absolute knowledge. Certainly, one finds in his work a scheme for the progressive realization of the liberating potential of men, who, through the faculty of reason, would ascend from the primitive stage of animality to the kingdom of freedom, after having liquidated the slavery regime that represented capitalism. There is progress there, understood as an inexorable advance towards a level of freedom, contradicted by historical experience, which shows us Bakunin, too, as an illustrious son of his time. However, although he did not deny the existence of human progress as the destiny of humanity, freedom as a goal did not imply the assumption of the violent appetites for natural conquest that we find in Marx, nor the path without stumbling blocks. Progress is excellent, it's true. but the more it develops, the more it will become the cause of intellectual and, consequently, material slavery, the cause of poverty and mental retardation of the people, because it will constantly widen the abyss that separates the intellectual level of the privileged classes from the level of the great masses of the people. For him, there was no logical argument, nor could there be, that would authorize us to affirm that progress was the destiny of humanity. We cannot say that this progress is identical in all historical periods of a people. On the contrary, it proceeds through actions and setbacks. Sometimes it is very fast, very sensitive and wide-ranging, other times it slows down or stops, and even seems to go backwards. What are the determining factors in all of this? This obviously depends on the character of the events of a given historical period. There are events that electrify people and propel them forward, other events have such a deplorable, discouraging and depressing effect on the mentality of the people that they often crush them, lead them astray or sometimes completely pervert them. In general, it is possible to observe two inverse movements in the historical development of the people, which I will allow myself to compare with the ebb and flow of ocean tides. Unholy intrusion into secret places has brought infinite misfortune, accused Melville, while Blake pointed out that the paths of progress are straight, but the paths without progress are the paths of genius, and it is difficult to think that Bakunin disagreed with them. Material progress, far from dignifying work, had placed it on a slope of increasing degradation, and machinery reinforced oppression, when it had promised workers definitive freedom from labor slavery. This remarkable fact is that all the inventions of the mind, all the great applications of science to industry, to commerce, and generally to social life, have hitherto only benefited the privileged classes and the power of the states, those eternal protectors of iniquities, political and social. They never benefited the masses of the people. It is enough to mention, for example, machines, so that every worker and every sincere supporter of the emancipation of labor agrees with us on this point. Furthermore, Bakunin warned against the establishment of the empire of scientism, because, even though science was indispensable for the rational organization of society, the subordination of man to its sphere would reduce the field of passions, the raw material of life. Science is the scope of life, but it is not life itself. Science is immutable, impersonal, general, abstract, and insensitive like the laws it ideally reproduces. Life is fleeting and transitory, but it also vibrates with reality and individuality, with sensitivity, suffering, enjoyment, aspirations, needs and passions. By itself, it spontaneously creates real things and beings. Science creates nothing. Furthermore, the consecration of science as a domain constituted the quickest way to screw into power a caste of rulers, whose legitimacy would reside in the monopoly of objective knowledge. This would quickly lead to the creation of a new class, a moral entity that existed outside universal social life, represented by a corporation of educated scholars, which would have to be liquidated so that its knowledge could be disseminated widely among the masses. Little inclined to praise the factory world, Bakunin believed that the proletariat, in the sense given by Marx, did not have any objective privilege that would make it the sole protagonist of the revolution. In general, the protagonists would be all those who experienced ignominy and oppression in their own flesh, including the mass of people excluded from society, the lumpen, who had nothing to lose except their chains. He never harbored Marx's disparaging fury for the peasants. The peasants can be motivated to action and, sooner or later, so will the social revolution. And, having not granted the productive forces a messianic role, he could hardly have granted revolutionary privileges to industrial workers. Without comprehensive theoretical inclinations and free from the Enlightenment temptations to dominate nature, Bakunin was always very clear that it was not necessary to witness abysses of opprobrium or harden the soul to achieve a social order based on individual freedom and collective solidarity. But he also knew, and above all, that the path to this new society did not allow for unauthorized shortcuts, and that the ends were already determined in the means. The technique, stupid. The technique, about the ends and the means. The central knot of Marx's emancipatory theory resided in the fact that the defense of technical development, which presupposed the open apology for the industrial system, with its procession of factories, discipline, hierarchization of social relations, mechanical routines, predation on the environment, necessity increasing number of new energy sources, etc., had its natural corollary in the centralization of political power and the division between leaders and those led. At this point, both Marx and Engels fully shared the theoretical universe on which the edifice of political economy had been erected, and, not ignoring the consequences it brought to the arena of power, no one could accuse them of having been incoherent. Engels, who knew firsthand the spectacle of factory misery, offers a scrupulous portrait of the inner workings of the factory. The mechanical automaton of a large factory is much more tyrannical than the small capitalists who employed workers. For working hours, at least, one can write on the doors of these factories, "Lasciate ogni autonomy, voi che entrate." Leave all hope, you who enter. If man, with science and inventive genius, subjects the forces of nature to himself, these, the moment he employs them, take revenge on him, subjecting him to a true despotism, independent of all social organization. Wanting to abolish authority in large industry is wanting to abolish industry itself, destroy the steam spinning to return to the spinning wheel. This dichotomy between religious faith in progress or an inevitable return to the caves, notoriously demagogic and false, reflected the general astray of Marx, Engels, and Marxism in the labyrinth of technological determinism. To keep the machines moving, they need an engineer to monitor the steam engine, mechanics for daily repairs and many other handlers to transport products from one room to another, etc. All these workers, men, women, and children, are forced to start and finish their work at times determined by the steam authority, which ignores individual autonomy. Big industry manufactured factory herds in series, individuals lacking autonomy, submissive and obedient to the dictates of the machine, but this was a painful and ineluctable condition for the establishment of socialism. Obviously, the authority of steam could not be called into question, because that would compromise the entire theory of the need for the development of productive forces and even the concept of revolution, which, according to Engels himself, is certainly the most authoritarian thing that there is. It is the act by which one part of the population imposes its will on the other part by means of rifles, bayonets and cannons. Authoritarian means par excellence, and the victorious party, if it does not want to have fought in vain, must continue that dominance with the terror that its weapons inspire in the reactionaries. It was a bleak panorama, and its corresponding doctrine that machines should never be judged or chosen according to political criteria was undemocratic and deeply authoritarian. However, all socialists are in agreement that the political state, and with it political authority, will disappear as a result of the next social revolution, and this means that public functions will lose their political character and will become simple administrative functions, taking care of true social interests. But anti-authoritarians demand that the authoritarian political state be abolished with the stroke of a pen, before the social conditions that gave rise to it are destroyed. Paradoxically, Adam Smith had forcefully stated that man, subjected to a routine and meaningless function, was nothing more than a wretch in perpetual search for, often brutal, compensations. The man who spends his entire life performing a few simple operations, the effects of which are always the same, or nearly so, has no opportunity to exercise his intellectual capacity or his ability to find expedients to avoid difficulties that never occur. Naturally, therefore, he loses the habit of this exercise and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible to conceive of a human being. The torpor of his reasoning makes him not only incapable of savoring or taking part in any rational conversation, but also of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender feeling, and consequently, even incapable of forming any sensible judgment with regard to many of the common duties of life. Bakunin's observations were in line with Smith's statement that exhausted workers were incapable of feeling any passion for the common good, because they lacked the material means necessary to transform political freedom into reality, because they remained slaves forced to work for hunger. Obviously, Bakunin confirmed Smith's impressions, but he did not look for false paths or mysterious forces, market, productive forces, as antidotes against exploitation. If history had any mission, it was the one that corresponded with the vast and sacred task of transforming the millions of wage slaves into a humane and free society, based on equal rights for all. Bakunin believed that this mechanistic fatalism that surrounded Marx's texts was false, and his motto, "To freedom for freedom's sake," established a coherence between means and ends that we did not find in his opponent's texts. For him, authority and autonomy were not relative things, whose scope varies in different phases of social development, as Engels stated. Furthermore, freedom, he wrote, is indivisible. It is not possible to suppress a part of it without completely destroying it as a whole. This small part of freedom that is being limited is the very essence of my freedom, it is everything. If a gigantic factory system was the only way to achieve freedom, but at the same time factory work was intrinsically alienating, through what formula could those exploited daily by steam build a free society? Where would the lucidity and energy necessary to engender something similar to a passion for the common good come from? How much time would you dedicate to this task? Was it just a Sunday afternoon pastime? Similarly, for Bakunin, the existence of a centralized power in the form of a state, understood as a vehicle for the conquest of freedom after a transition phase, was a complete absurdity. Abstraction that devours the lives of the people, instrument and patrimony of a privileged class. Every state, federated or not, stressed the Russian, must seek to become the most powerful, under the danger of total ruin. Every state is then the most blatant, cynical, and complete denial of humanity. At this point, Marx, in his insistence on the need for a workers' state, once again spun all the luck of his theory into a good dose of faith to believe that, once this Leviathan commanded by the workers was created, it would itself collapse. It is not known very well why these procedures are being carried out. Bakunin was much more complete when he announced that the only great and omnipotent authority, at the same time natural and rational, the only one we can respect, will be that of the collective and public spirit of a society founded on equality and solidarity, and it would be this collective spirit that would redefine the term effectiveness, depending on the effect that was sought to be achieved, and not on gigantic quantitative increases in production. The concentration of political power can only produce slavery, because freedom and power are mutually exclusive. Every government, including the most democratic, is a natural enemy of freedom, thinking, like Marx, that the state or technology can have a different use from that for which it was imagined, is the great illusion of modernity in which it has become trapped. He understood well that the most shameful vice that socialism has to eradicate is not wage labor, but the degrading division of manual labor and intellectual labor, or, according to another formula, the separation between the spiritual forces of labor and manual labor. But Marx did not ask himself whether this was not an order of problems independent of the problems posed by the game of the capitalist economy itself. Although he witnessed the separation of property and function in capitalist enterprise, he did not question whether the administrative function, insofar as it is permanent, could not, independently of any property monopoly, give rise to a new oppressive class. And yet, if we understand well how a revolution can expropriate expropriators, we do not see how a production model based on the subordination of those who execute to those who coordinate could not automatically produce a social structure defined by the dictatorship of a bureaucratic caste. For Simone Weil, this inversion of the relationship between the means and the end is the fundamental madness that constitutes the reason for everything senseless and bloody that has occurred throughout history. Tawney noted the terrible misfortune that men were condemned to always confuse the means with the ends. Unless they have a clear conception that what matters are the ends and not the means, they speak as if man existed for industry, instead of industry existing for man. Intending to build a world free from oppression through authority is to wrap theory in barbed wire or to believe in the transubstantiation of harmful means into healthy ends. Justice is never established through unfair means, nor is freedom established through a dictatorship, even a temporary one. The means carry inevitable consequences in themselves and result in purposes that they also carry within themselves. The ends, on the contrary, are already understood in the means. Thus, fair means make justice reign, hic et nunc, even if it is presented as an ultimate objective. Means establishing freedom in immediate relationships establish freedom, etc. There can be no contradiction between ends and means. Bakunin did not have, nor did he seek to have, to any great extent, the dubious privilege of prophesying the destiny of humanity. Even so, his work, like his life, is not free from exaggerations or diffuse paths, which did not prevent him from being shrewd enough not to develop a theory that would threaten him with a dead end. Engels and Marx, on the other hand, ended up resembling those Greeks that Antigone accused of being skilled soothsayers, more involuntary worshippers of injustice. Cranston and the imaginary dialogue between poverty and slavery. Cranston's work constitutes a small and little-known jewel within the panorama of dissemination of socialist thought. The main of his numerous merits is that he was able to condense, in a few pages, the theoretical density of the dispute between Marx and Bakunin, and, by extension, to have x-rayed in clear, short, and expository paragraphs, the differences that fractured the labor movement in the 19th century. And nothing could better exemplify Cranston's acuteness and ability to investigate the parallel universes of both than the phrase he puts in Bakunin's mouth: slavery is the worst of evils, Marx, and not poverty. Condemning poverty and expressing sincere repugnance at its progressive spread was an attitude that honored Marx. However, the main issue regarding poverty resided in its nature, not in its simple existence. Since the works of Salins, Mauss, Mead, or Malinowski, we know that the category poverty is defined by exclusively material parameters, created by advanced industrial societies. To cite a specific case that Marx himself looked at, when explaining the need for the expansion of industrial capitalism, in economic terms, it is possible that India benefited, and there is no doubt that it benefited in the long term, but socially it became disorganized and thus fell victim to misery and degradation. The same happened during the period of enclosures in England. Between the 18th and 19th centuries, workers increased their money in exchange for selling their souls to the devil. As Collingwood states, anyone who sticks to the fact that 10 fish were caught where 5 were previously caught is mistaken, and uses this as a criterion for progress. The conditions and consequences of this change must be taken into account. One must ask what was done with the additional fish, or with the additional leisure. One must ask what value was placed on the social and religious institutions that sacrificed themselves for those extra fish. In short, one must judge the relative value of two different ways of life, taken as two wholes. On the other hand, Cranston, in a kind of verbal fencing provided by the use of dialogue, practically synthesizes all the points of divergence between Marx and Bakunin, demonstrating a deep knowledge of the work of both, enriched by solid argumentation and a solvent use of resources. Narratives? Far from propaganda literature, the author assumes the role of a mere spectator of the meeting. He is an exceptional guest, a figure who faithfully and objectively reports a real imaginary event. He does not succumb to the temptation to contribute to the glorification of Marx or Bakunin. He also no longer places a stone in their respective pantheons, nor does he fall into the assertive poverty of the most rampant propaganda. The originality of the imaginary dialogue is the deep respect it shows for the colossi it gathers around a kettle, but also the deference it shows towards the reader, avoiding hasty conclusions and judgments, characteristic of a thought based on thoughtlessness and reproduction of hollow and mesmerizing labels. Cranston's book is, ultimately, an invitation to penetrate, slowly, carefully and without dogmatism, the texts of Marx and Bakunin. Presentation. The relations between Marx and Bakunin were, as we know, among the most delicate. Even today, supporters of one or the other of these giants of the social issue, and I include among them those who are the most objective, are disturbed in their assessments by the defects, complements of their qualities, of these two men, in fact, outstanding. Bakunin is the hurricane. A man of action, like Diogenes demonstrating movement by walking, every opportunity is a good one for him to apply theories that, sometimes, are only in gestation in him, but which, preceded by a more or less empirical application, prove to be valid in the long term, without ever managing, however, to impose itself on the social fact. Marx is the cabinet man. A thinker, having masterfully assimilated the works of predecessors that he has since eclipsed, he has the advantage over Bakunin of advocating an experience that innovates nothing, that only displaces the experience of power. The social question will be resolved for him on the day when the bourgeoisie, which took the scepter of authority from the nobility, renounces, by hook or by crook, its predominance, to give way to a conscious proletariat, capable of directing humanity towards socialism. It can be stated, however, that these propositions more easily achievable than Bakunin's, since they only transmute the principle of authority, benefiting one class at the expense of another, have corresponded, in their application to an important extent of the planet, to the hopes of its initiator. The political man, the party man, will answer in the affirmative, that's for sure. For the sociologist, for the impartial observer, it will be at least doubtful. As for the denier of authority, he is right to denounce, with the support of evidence, the weaknesses of the Marxist system or its derivatives, which he allows to persist in our days, sometimes worsening, in the nations where he commands absolutely, all the flaws that Marx, as well as Bakunin, denounced in the practices of the bourgeois state. During a broadcast on the BBC, in London, in October 1962, a knowledgeable sociologist, Maurice Cranston, who knows his subject perfectly, and this is no small compliment, imagined a dialogue between Marx and Bakunin, a conversation that these two men supposedly held during the meeting they had in London on November 3, 1864. In this interview, broadcast to millions of listeners, and for which we must congratulate English radio, the author endeavored to reconstruct, based on the particular theses developed by the two thinkers in their respective works, a credible controversy that reveals extraordinary erudition. We will find here, masterfully positioned, the two men who dominated their time on a social level, in the harsh debate on this eternally current topic: should we trust in freedom? Or, on the contrary, is authority indispensable? The text that our voters will read was published in December 1962 by the London magazine Anarchy. It was translated into Spanish and inserted in the magazine Umbral in Paris, then taken up in part by several North American and Latin American publications in Spanish. Umanita Nova, the organ of our Italian friends in Rome, presented it, in turn, to its readers. Contrecourant had the duty of presenting to the French public the interesting work of Maurice Cranston, to which Louis Dorlet's magazine Defense de l'Homme had alluded in one of its issues. Behold, it has been done. Louis Levet. Imaginary dialogue between Marx and Bakunin. Bakunin: my dear Marx, I can offer you tobacco and tea. I fear, however, that my hospitality will be too frugal, reduced as I am today to poverty. Marx: as for me, I'm still poor. Bakunin: I know all the forms of poverty, and this is the worst of evils. Bakunin: slavery is the worst of evils, Marx, and not poverty. A cup of tea? I always have it ready to be served. In London, the tenants are very attentive. When I lived in Paddington Green, there was a maid, Graca, who did all the work. She went up and down the stairs all day and part of the night with hot sugary water. Marx: if the working class in England led a pitiful existence, it would be the first to rise up. Bakunin: she should. But will she? Marx: it will be her or the Germans. Bakunin: the Germans will never rise up. They will die before they can do it. Marx: it is not a question of national temperament, Bakunin. It's a question of industrial progress. There where workers have a class consciousness. Bakunin: there is no class consciousness here in England. The maid I told you about just now was completely docile, resigned, submissive. It saddened me to see her so exploited. Marx: from what I see, you yourself did not fail to take advantage. Bakunin exploration in London reigns everywhere. In this immense city, full of misery, in these dark and sordid streets, no one would dare erect barricades. No, Marx, this is no place for a socialist. Marx, however, it is almost the only place where we are accepted. I've lived here for about 15 years. Bakunin, I'm sorry you didn't meet me at Paddington Green. I stayed there for about 12 months. When I read your letter announcing your visit to me yesterday, I remembered that our paths have not crossed since our distant journeys to Paris. Marx, you had to leave Paris in 1845. Bakunin, no, in April, before the Dresden insurrection, when I fell, so to speak, into the hands of the enemy. They kept me in prison for 10 years, then I was deported to Siberia. As you know, I managed to escape and reach London. Now, it is possible for me to go and live in Italy. I will return to Florence next week. Marx, very well, you will finally be able to move. Bakunin, I move constantly. I'm not a discreet revolutionary like you. The crowned heads of Europe surprised me in motion. Marx, the crowned heads of Europe also expelled me from several countries. And poverty forced me to abandon several places. Bakunin, the poor. I'm always penniless, constantly borrowing from my friends. I lived a large part of my life on borrowed money, except in prison. I'm 50 years old now, but I never think about money. These thoughts are good for the bourgeoisie. Marx, you're lucky, you don't have a family to support. Bakunin, you must know that I lived with a woman in Poland, however, it is certain that I did not have children. Do you want more tea? I'll take a little more. A Russian cannot live without tea. Marx, and you Russians are numerous, noble Russians, to be precise. Considering your temperament, it must be difficult to penetrate the mentality of the proletariat. Bakunin, and what do you yourself think of that, Marx? Aren't you the son of a rich bourgeois, of a lawyer? And your wife, Fräulein von Westphalen, is not the daughter of Baron von Westphalen and the sister of the Prussian Minister of the Interior? She admits that this is a very suspicious commoner origin. Marx, socialism needs intellectuals as much as it needs the working class. Furthermore, I suffered persecution and starvation during the difficult days of exile. Bakunin, the nights in prisons are even more endless. I've become so used to hunger that I almost no longer feel it. Marx, I think the worst thing is to see your children die of starvation. Bakunin, I agree with you. Being sentenced to death is not as distressing as one might believe. In a sense, I found this even amusing. Marx, since I came to London, I have lived in sordid and cheaply furnished rooms. I had to borrow money and buy on credit. I gave clothes as collateral to pay my rent. My daughters are instructed to respond that I am absent when creditors present themselves. All of us, my wife and I, my daughters and an old servant, lived crammed into 2 poorly furnished rooms. I try to work on the same lame table that my wife uses to sew while my daughters play, and we remain without electricity for hours to save money. My wife is often sick, as are my daughters. However, I avoid calling a doctor, as I cannot pay him or buy medicines that he would prescribe. Bakunin, but, my dear Marx, what about your collaborator Engels? I always thought that. Marx, Engels is very generous, but he cannot always help me. Believe me, I have suffered all kinds of misfortunes. The biggest one occurred to me 8 years ago, when my son Edouard died at the age of 6. Francis Bacon said that important people are so preoccupied with multiple businesses that they can overcome their sadness when they suffer similar losses. I, Bakunin, am not one of these important people. My son's death hit me so deeply that today I feel the pain of loss as I did on the day he died. Bakunin, if it's money you lack at this level, Alexander Herzen has it in abundance. Very often I had to resort to him. I don't see why he couldn't help you too. Marx, Herzen is a bourgeois reformist of the most superficial kind. I don't want to address certain people. Bakunin, if Herzen had not existed, Your Communist Manifesto would not have been translated into Russian 2 years ago. Marx, a late translation, but I thank you for it. Perhaps you would now like to translate Philosophy Misery. Bakunin. No, dear Marx, I do not place this work alongside your greatest writings. Besides, you're too hard on P.J. Proudhon. Marx. Proudhon is not a socialist. He is an ignoramus, a typical low-class autodidact, a dupe in economics, who displays qualities that he does not possess. Your pseudoscientific charlatanistic boasting is indeed intolerable. Bakunin. I admit that Proudhon is a little limited, but he is 100 times more revolutionary than all the doctrinaire and bourgeois socialists. He has the courage to declare himself an atheist. And, above all, he fights for freedom against authority, and for socialism, which must be entirely free from all government regulation. Proudhon is a true anarchist. Marx. In other words, his ideas are very similar to yours. Bakunin. I received your influence, however, in my opinion, Proudhon does not go far enough. He hesitates in the face of action and violence. He does not understand that destruction is itself a form of creation. I am an active revolutionary, Proudhon is a theoretical socialist, just like you. Marx. I don't understand what you mean by theoretical socialist, Bakunin, but I would venture to say that I am as active a socialist as you are. Bakunin. My dear Marx, I am not insinuating anything that is not respectful towards you. On the contrary, I remember that you were expelled from the University of Bonn because of a pistol duel. I recognize that you would be a useful soldier for the revolution if you could sometimes escape from the library of the British Museum and take part in the barricades. When I talk about you as a theoretical socialist, I mean that you are a theorist of socialism like Proudhon. I could never write a philosophical treatise of the importance of yours and Proudhon's. I do not exceed the limits of the pamphlet. Marx. You are a well-educated man. You couldn't write to the populace like Proudhon does. Bakunin. Indeed, it is true that Proudhon is the son of a peasant and a self-taught man, while I am the son of a large landowner. I guess what you think, Marx, that I studied Hegelian philosophy at the University of Berlin. Marx. You couldn't have had better training. And from a socialist of your culture, we could expect something more than holding a rifle to a barricade and setting fire to the Dresden Opera House. Bakunin. You flatter me, Marx. Personally, I wasn't the one who set fire to the Dresden Opera House. Furthermore, I was not in Dresden as an anarchist. The facts in question, you must remember, are the following: the Saxon Diet had voted for a federal constitution for Germany. The King of Saxony wanted nothing to do with unification and had dissolved the Diet. The people felt outraged and, in May of that same year, they erected barricades in the streets. The leaders of parliament, who were bourgeois liberals, invaded the consistorial palace and proclaimed a provisional government. Marx. Precisely, I think that such a cause could not inspire a man like you, so opposed to all forms of government. Bakunin. The people had not taken up arms against the king, they had only risen up. And that already represents something. Finding myself by chance in Dresden, I put myself at the service of the revolution. First of all, I knew the military strategy and the Saxon liberal bourgeoisie was completely unaware of it. With 2 Polish officers, I formed the general staff of the insurgent forces. Marx. Soldiers of fortune, right? However, you were not happy. Bakunin. No, that only lasted a few days. The king received Prussian reinforcements and we had to evacuate Dresden. As you said, some of our men set the opera house on fire. I was in favor of blowing up the consistorial palace with us inside, but at that moment the Poles disappeared and the last of the Saxon liberals wanted to transfer their government to Chemnitz. I could not desert and was taken prisoner. The burgomaster of Chemnitz surprised us at the moment in question. Marx. So, Bakunin, you were imprisoned because of German unity and because you favored the establishment by force of a bourgeois liberal government. You will admit that there is a certain irony in this. Bakunin. I could have been shot for that. but the experience made me a different man. I certainly benefited from your example. We didn't all have the same opinions in 1848, but now I recognize that you were going much further than I was. I admit that the resonance of the European revolutionary movement went to my head and that I was more attracted to the negative side of the revolution than the positive side. Marx, I am glad that you have profited from the years of forced reflection. Bakunin, however, there is one point on which I was right and on which you were wrong. As a Slav, I wanted the liberation of the Slavic people from the Germanic yoke, and I wanted this to come through a revolution, that is, by the destruction of the existing regimes in Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Turkey, and by the reorganization of popular life from bottom to top in complete freedom. Marx, this means that you have not yet abandoned your old panslavism. You are the same old Russian patriot from the Paris days. Bakunin, what do you understand by Russian patriot? Be frank, Marx. Do you still believe I'm some kind of Russian government agent? Marx, I never believed that, and one of the reasons why I accepted your invitation today is precisely to erase the remotest memory of this unfortunate suspicion. Bakunin, however, the slander was first published in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, when you were its director. Marx, I already explained the circumstances to you. The news came to us from our Paris correspondent, who heard from George Sand that you were a Russian spy. We then published George Sand's correction and yours in full. We couldn't do more than we did. I personally apologized. Bakunin, however, you were unable to dispel this rumor, even when I was transferred from an Austrian prison to another in Russia, nor later, when I was deported to Siberia. You have never been to prison, Marx. You don't know what it's like to feel buried alive and to have to say to yourself, at all hours of the day and night, I'm a slave, a finished man. Feeling entirely devoted to the cause of freedom, ready to sacrifice yourself for it, and seeing your enthusiasm annihilated behind four walls. This is all quite harsh. However, even more terrible is, at the moment of leaving captivity, finding yourself accused of this infamous slander, being an agent of the tyrant who locked you up. Marx, forget it. From now on, no one thinks about it anymore. Bakunin, Marx, this lie is beginning to circulate again right here in London. It was published in one of those newspapers circulated by Denis Urquhart, an English friend of yours, I'm sorry to tell you. Marx Urquhart is a monomaniac. He loves everything Turkish and systematically hates everything Russian. He doesn't have his head right. Bakunin, however, you write in your publications and speak on your platform, my dear Marx. Marx, this may seem extravagant, but we can only agree on our views on Palmerston. At least he believes so, and he offers me to publish my works. It's propaganda, and he pays, as does the New York Tribune. But be sure, Bakunin, that the reappearance of this idiotic accusation disgusted me more than it disgusted you. I assure you that I never participated in that diffusion. I am the first to deplore it. Bakunin, I sincerely accept your apology, Marx. Marx, there is something I must tell you. I consider your panslavism to be contrary to the interests of socialism, and it can only lead to a sinister growth of Russian power in Europe. Bakunin, panslavism, that is, democratic panslavism, is part of the great European liberation movement. Marx, absurd, absurd. Bakunin, prove me wrong, Marx. Justify your statement. Marx, the apogee of panslavism was reached in the 8th and 9th centuries, when slaves from the south still occupied Hungary, Austria, and threatened Byzantium. If they could not defend themselves then and maintain their independence when their two enemies, the Germans and the Magyars, were strangling each other, how could they do it now, after 1,000 years of oppression and denationalization? Almost all European countries have scattered minorities, vestiges of the past, which give impetus to the development of history. Did you know that Hegel called these minorities ethnic foliage? Bakunin, in other words, you consider these people to be negligible quantities, unworthy of the right to life. Marx, I don't understand the language of rights. The existence of these people is a protest against history and, therefore, they are always reactionary. The proof: the galley keepers of Scotland, the defenders of the Stuarts from 1640 to 1745, the Bretons of the Chouannerie for supporters of the Bourbons from 1792 to 1800. Or the Basques in Spain or with Austria in 1848. Who made the revolution? The Germans and the Magyars. And who supplied the weapons and allowed the reactionary Austrians to crush the revolution? The Slavs. They attacked the Italians, entered Vienna like a tornado and restored the Habsburg monarchy. The Slavs kept them in power. Bakunin, yes, but they were the Slavs in the emperor's army. You know very well that the Pan-Slavic movement is democratic and formally opposed to the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and the Hohenzollerns. Marx, yes, I read your manifestos. I know what they would like to get. Bakunin, so you are informed about what I propose: the abolition of all artificial borders in Europe and the creation of limits drawn by the sovereign will of the people themselves. Marx, that sounds very good. However, you simply ignore the real obstacles that arise in front of each of these plans, the completely different levels of civilization that the different European peoples have reached. Bakunin, I always took difficulties into account, Marx. I maintain that the only way to overcome them is through the practice of a federative policy. The Slav is not the enemy of the Germans and the democratic Magyars. He offers them a fraternal alliance based on freedom, equality, and fraternity. Marx, mere words, they lack meaning in the face of facts, and facts are as simple as they are brutal. With the exception of your race and that of the Poles, perhaps the Slavs of Turkey, the other Slavs have no future, because they lack indispensable qualities for historical, geographical, economic, political, and industrial independence. In short, they lack civilization. Bakunin, and do the Germans have civilization? Do you believe that great civilization gives the Germans the right to dominate Europe and commit crimes against other peoples? Marx, what crimes? In vain I endeavored to consult history, and I believe that the only offense committed by the Germans and Magyars against the Slavs was to prevent them from becoming Turks. Bakunin, well, my dear Marx, I always said about Germany what Voltaire said about God: if he didn't exist, he would have to be invented. There is nothing more effective in keeping Panslavism alive than hatred for Germany. Marx, here is another proof that your unfortunate Panslavism is reactionary. He teaches hatred against the Germans and not against their real enemy, the bourgeoisie. Bakunin, both go together. It was the progress I made from the pure nationalism of my youth. Today I maintain that freedom is a lie for the vast majority of people as long as they are deprived of freedom, leisure, and bread. Marx, as you know, Bakunin, I consider you a friend, and I have no hesitation in considering you a socialist, despite. Bakunin, despite what? Marx, anyway, you always disparage what I call politics. Bakunin, it's true, parliament, parties, constituent assemblies and representative institutions don't interest me. Humanity needs something higher, a new world without laws and without the state. Marx, anarchy. Bakunin, yes, anarchy. We must overthrow the political set and moral order of the current world. We must change it from top to bottom. It is a chimera to believe that existing institutions can be modified. Marx, I don't want to change them, I simply say to the workers that they must take possession of them. Bakunin, they should be completely abolished. The state corrupts both our instincts and our will and our intelligence. The fundamental principle of all valid socialism is to destroy society. Marx, I call this a curious definition of socialism. Bakunin, definitions are of no importance to me, in this we differ completely. I don't think any prefabricated system can save the world. I don't have a system. I'm an investigator. I believe in both instinct and thought. Marx, but you will never be a socialist if you don't have a policy. Bakunin, then I have one. And if having a policy means predisposing things point by point, I'll tell you what my program is. First of all, abolish laws made by men. Marx, you cannot suppress laws. The entire universe is governed by laws. Bakunin, naturally, we cannot suppress natural laws, I agree with you. Men can increase their freedom by extending their knowledge of the natural laws that govern the universe. Man cannot ignore nature, and such a proposition would be absurd. This is not what I propose. I say that we should suppress man-made laws, artificial laws. In other terms, political and legal laws. Marx, you cannot seriously claim that society should not impose laws on its own members. Bakunin society does not need to impose laws. Man is, by his nature, a sociable being. Outside of society he can be an animal or a saint. There are laws in capitalist society because it is competitive and pits man against man. Freedom will only be possible when all men are equal, which is why there can be no freedom without socialism. Marx, I completely agree with you on this. Bakunin, you say you agree with me, Marx, but when I say that there can be no freedom without socialism, I also understand and emphasize that socialism without freedom is slavery and brutality. Marx, I never defended socialism without freedom. Bakunin, of course yes. You defend the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx, the dictatorship of the proletariat is at the same time a part of freedom and a part of the liberation process. Bakunin, when I speak of freedom, I think of the only freedom worthy of the name, the freedom that consists in the full development of all the material, intellectual and moral powers existing in man, a freedom that recognizes no restrictions other than those outlined for us by the laws of our own nature. I defend a freedom that, far from stopping as if at a limit before the freedom of others, on the contrary, is confirmed and expanded by the freedom of all. I desire freedom triumphant over brutal force and the principle of authority. Marx, I understand your words well, but I ignore the meaning you attribute to them. I tell you right away, very clearly, that you will never be able to hasten the advent of socialism or achieve anything substantial, in political terms, without starting from the principle of authority. Bakunin, socialism needs the principle of discipline and not authority. Not discipline imposed from outside, but voluntary and considered discipline, which man imposes on himself and which is perfectly in harmony with the principle of freedom. Marx, it seems that you did not derive much from the experience of your revolts, Bakunin. These movements could not assert themselves without the principle of authority. Captains are needed, even for the armies of anarchism. Bakunin, naturally, at the time of military action, in the middle of battle, roles are naturally divided, according to each person's abilities, some men direct and command and others carry out orders. But no function should remain fixed and petrified. There is no hierarchical order, today's commander must become a subordinate tomorrow. No one rises above others and, if it is necessary to do so for a while, it is to then descend again, like the waves of the sea, to the healthy level of equality. Marx, well then, Bakunin, if you admit that direction and command are necessary during battle, we can perhaps come to an agreement on the rest. I have always maintained that the dictatorship of the proletariat will only be necessary during the early days of socialism. As soon as the classless society has reached maturity, the state can disappear. To use an expression from my collaborator Engels, the state will empty itself. Bakunin, I see no trace of the emptying of the state in the Communist Manifesto that you and Engels wrote. It is an ingenious pamphlet that I would not have translated if I had not appreciated it as such. However, in fact, among the 10 points of the socialist program described by you in these pages, there are at least 9 that advocate the strengthening of the state. The state must own all the means of production, control trade and credit, impose forced labor and receive taxes, monopolize land, direct transport and communications and govern schools and universities. Marx, if you don't accept this program, it's because you don't want socialism. Bakunin, but that's not socialism, Marx. It is the purest form of statism, of the elephantine state of the Germans, inseparable from the guillotine. Socialism means control of industry and agriculture by the workers themselves. Marx, a socialist state is a proletarian state. Both must directly control the whole. Bakunin, this is the typical bourgeois illusion, the democratic illusion that maintains that the people can control the state. In practice, it is the state that controls the people, and, the stronger the state, the broader its domination. Observe what is happening in Germany. As the state strengthens itself, all the corruption that accompanies centralist politics seduces the public, which, however, is considered the most honest in the world. We must also add that the capitalist monopoly progresses at the same rate that the state prospers. Marx: the growth of the capitalist monopoly paves the way to socialism. The reason why Russia is so far from socialism lies in the fact that it has barely begun to emerge from feudalism. Bakunin: the Russian people are closer to socialism than you think, my dear Marx. In Russia, workers have a particular revolutionary tradition, and, for the liberation of the human species, a great role will be attributed to them. The Russian Revolution has deep roots in the soul of the people. In the 17th century, peasants rose up in the southeast, and in the 18th century, Pugachev led a peasant revolt in the Volga Valley, which lasted 2 years. Russians do not reject violence, they know that the fruit of human progress is stained with blood. They also do not retreat in the face of fire. The burning of Moscow, which was the starting point for the retreat of the Grand Army, is an originally Russian fact. They are the bonfires over which the human race must purge itself of the scum of slavery. Marx, my friend, what you have just said is very dramatic, but the concrete issue is that socialism depends on the formation of a class consciousness in the proletariat, and this we can only hope for in highly industrialized countries such as England, Germany, France. The peasants are least organized and, of all social classes, the least capable of carrying out the revolution. They are more retrograde than the lumpenproletariat, the destitute and the populace of the cities. They are pure barbarians, troglodytes. Bakunin: this is where our deep disagreement lies, Marx. For me, the finest flower of the proletariat is not, as you believe, the factory workers. Whatever their abilities, they are almost always semi-bourgeois or aspiring to be so. I met several of these in the labor movement in Switzerland, and I can assure you that they are all permeated with all the social prejudices, with all the petty aspirations of the middle class. Technicians are the least socialist of all workers. In my view, Marx, the elite of the proletariat is the great mass, the plebs, the millions of wretched and illiterate people ridiculed by you, and whom you call with disdain lumpenproletariat. Marx, I believe that you have not delved deeper into the concept of proletariat. The proletariat is not the poor, there have always been poor people. The proletariat is something new in history. It is not poverty or misfortune that makes men proletarians, it is their anger against the bourgeoisie, it is their dignity, their courage, and their resolution to want to put an end to their condition. The proletariat is only formed when indignation and class consciousness are associated with poverty. The proletariat is the class with revolutionary purpose, the class that aspires to the destruction of all classes, the class that cannot emancipate itself without emancipating the entire human species. Bakunin: your socialism does not eliminate classes, Marx, but it creates two, that of the leaders and that of the directed. It will require a government with many more functions to perform than the one it has generally assigned itself to date, and it will be the people who will be governed. On the one hand, the extreme left of the intelligentsia, the most despotic, the most arrogant class of people that can exist, will want to command in the name of experience. On the other side, there will be the simple and ignorant masses, who must obey. Marx: the legislators and administrators of the socialist state will be the representatives of the people. Bakunin: this is yet another liberal illusion, which maintains that a government emanating from an electoral consultation can represent the will of the people. Even Rousseau denied all credence to this statement. The instinctive intentions of government elites are always in opposition to the instinctive ends of the man in the street. Judging society from its elevated position, it is rare that governments are able to avoid acts of authority and domination. Marx: the failure of democracy is a consequence of the monopoly of political institutions taken over by the financial power of the bourgeoisie. Bakunin's socialist pseudo-democracy would be vitiated by other pressures. A parliament composed exclusively of workers, the same workers and the same socialist leaders as today, would transform overnight into an aristocratic parliament. It has always been like that. Send extremists to occupy state positions and they will become conservatives. Marx: there are reasons for that. Bakunin: the main reason is that the democratic state is nonsense. By its nature, the state is authority, force, domination and, consequently, inequality. Democracy, by definition, is equality, therefore, democracy and the state cannot coexist. Proudhon was never so far-sighted as when he declared that universal suffrage was counter-revolutionary. Marx: this is an evolution that is truly indicative of Proudhon's journalistic mentality. It is true that workers are too often in poverty and too easily influenced by bourgeoisie propaganda to be able to make good use of their vote, but universal suffrage can be used for socialist ends. We can enter politics and do what is considered democratic. We cannot achieve all of our objectives with our entry into parliament, however, at least some of them. Bakunin: no state, not even a republic dyed the brightest red, will be able to give the people what they need most: freedom. All states, including your socialist state, dear Marx, are based on force. Marx: what other means could we employ? Bakunin: education, knowledge. Marx: the people lack education. Bakunin: he can be polite. Marx: and who, then, can educate him if not the state? Bakunin: society must educate itself. Unfortunately, all the governments in the world have left the people in such a state of ignorance that it would be necessary to open schools not only for children, but also for adults. These schools should be rid of every vestige of the principle of authority. And I'm not talking about schools in the conventional sense of the word, but about popular academies where students, rich in experience, would sometimes be in a position to teach their own masters. In this way, a kind of intellectual fraternity would develop between them. Marx: after all, you admit two categories, masters and teachers. I do not believe that education will be a major problem once a socialist society is established. Bakunin: yes, the first problem is economic emancipation, the rest will come by itself. Marx: nothing will come by itself, and it will be the socialist state that must determine the sequence. All historical experience is there to demonstrate it. The most evolved people in Europe today, the French and the Germans, owe their education to a solid state system that directs public instruction. In countries where the state is not concerned with school education, the people are hopelessly illiterate. Bakunin: in England, large colleges and universities escape state control. Marx: however, what is worse, they are in the hands of the Anglican Church, which, by the way, is part of the state. Bakunin: Oxford and Cambridge colleges are governed by independent and traditional societies. Marx: you know nothing about English life, Bakunin. The two faculties were radically reformed by laws that emanated from Parliament. The state had to intervene to save them from complete intellectual decay, but despite this, they are still backward if we compare them with German universities. Bakunin: however, its existence demonstrates that it is possible for students to control their own faculties. And there is no reason to suppose that the workers could not manage their lands or their factories by the same procedure. Marx: there will come a day, certainly, when that will be the case. However, while we wait, a workers' state must take the place of the bourgeois owners. Bakunin: this is precisely where we differ, Marx. You believe that it is necessary to organize workers to conquer the state, while I, on the contrary, want to organize them to destroy the state, or, if you prefer, to liquidate it. You want to use political institutions and I would like the people to be able to feed rate freely and spontaneously. Marx: what do you mean by spontaneously feed rating? Bakunin: the work will organize itself. Producer associations based on mutual support will be formed by district and these districts will freely associate with larger units, all power will come from the base. Marx: projects of this kind are completely chimerical. It is a copy of the Phalansteries and the 20th edition of the New Jerusalem, proposed by the utopian socialists. These are discordant projects but, unfortunately, dangerous because they introduce into socialism a bastard, illegitimate notion, which can take the place of the true solution, causing an immediate distraction in men's attention. Its effect is conservative and reactionary. Bakunin, if there is one reproach that you cannot really direct at me, Marx, it is to tell me that I divert men's attention from the immediate struggle. Furthermore, I think like you that there are only two parties in the world, the party of revolution and that of reaction. The pacifist socialists, with their cooperative societies and model peoples, belong to the party of reaction. The party of revolution, unfortunately, is already divided into two factions, the champions of the socialist state, which you represent, and the libertarian socialists, of which I am a member. Your faction has numerous supporters, naturally, in Germany and even here, in England. But the socialists in Italy and Spain are all libertarians. The problem that arises is the following: which trend will prevail in the international labor movement? Marx, the truly socialist tendency, I believe, and not anarchist cooperation. Bakunin, you call your socialism true, pure, because you are mistaken about the nature of the popular dictatorship. You don't realize the danger there could be in establishing a new slavery following in the footsteps of other states. Marx, you assume that because the state has always been the instrument of the ruling class, this must continue forever. Is it not possible to imagine the existence of a class other than the state? Bakunin, we can imagine a state in such a different way that it would no longer answer to that name. For example, we can think of the system proposed by Proudhon, a simple business bureau, a central settlement bank at the service of society. Marx, this will, I believe, be the form that a socialist society will definitively take. There will come a day when the government of the people will give way to the administration of things, but before the state disappears, it must be strengthened. Bakunin, this is not only paradoxical, but contradictory. Marx, what do you want? And so, you know Hegel like I do, and you know that the logic of history is the logic of contradictions. What is asserted can be denied. Bakunin, the argument is valid as a Hegelian one, but it is worthless historically speaking. You will never be able to destroy the state by strengthening it. I am your disciple, Marx. The more time passes, the more certain I am that you are right to open the march along the great path of economic revolution, calling on all of us to follow in your footsteps. However, I was never able to understand and accept your authoritarian projects. Marx, if you are an anarchist, you cannot be my disciple. However, perhaps it would be preferable to examine the details of your error. In the first place, you refer to the principle of authority as if it, in every place and in every circumstance, were erroneous. It's a superficial point of view. We live in an industrial age, modern factories, where hundreds of workers run complicated machines, have driven the modest laboratories of artisans out of competition. Even agriculture will soon be dominated by machines. Combined mutual action rejects independent individual action, concerted action means organization, and organization implies authority. In the medieval world, the small craftsman could be his boss. However, in the modern world, direction and subordination are necessary. If you set out to resist all types of authority, you condemn yourself to living in the past. Bakunin, I don't want to resist any kind of authority, Marx. In matters of footwear, for example, I respect the authority of the shoemaker. If it is construction, that of the architect. For health, I rely on the doctor's authority. However, I cannot allow the shoemaker, the architect, or the doctor to exercise their authority over me. I accept your advice amicably, I respect your experience and knowledge, but I reserve the right to criticism and censorship. I am not content to consult a single authority. I consult several of them and compare their points of view. I don't consider anyone infallible. I recognize that I cannot know everything. No one can know everything. Omniscient and universal man does not exist. My reason prevents me from accepting a fixed, constant, and universal authority. Marx. But if you suppressed authority in economic and political life, nothing would work. For example, how could trains run if there was no one vested with the power to establish the lines, if there was no one to decide what time the trains should leave, no one to set the timetables and prevent accidents? Bakunin railwaymen can very well appoint agents themselves for all these functions and, in the same way, freely obey the necessary instructions. According to your brand of socialism, Marx, I can easily imagine that the drivers of archaic locomotives would set the machines in motion for a new class of privileged travelers, the administrators of the socialist state, with an imposing cigar between their lips, in the first-class carriages. Marx, listen, Bakunin, I am no more a lover of the state than you. Every authentic socialist admits the disappearance of the state as soon as the triumph of socialism makes it useless. However, you want the political state to disappear abruptly, leaving workers without any kind of direction, discipline, or control. The crux of the matter is that you, anarchists, lack plans for the future. Bakunin, it is precisely because we cannot predict exactly what the future will be that I distrust detailed plans. When selfish instincts give way to fraternity, I believe that the technical problems of production and distribution will be resolved by common agreement and with the goodwill of the people. Marx, your doubts, Bakunin, are partly psychological and partly moral. And they are also intellectuals. You are wrong when you believe that the state created capital. This accentuates the simplism of your point of view. You believe that it is enough to remove the state's obstacle for capitalism to automatically disappear. The truth is quite different. Let's suppress capital, let's suppress the concentration of the means of production in the hands of a few privileged people, and the state will soon stop being harmful. Bakunin, evil resides in the true nature of the state. All states are the denial of freedom. Marx, by adopting an extreme position in relation to the state, you greatly compromise the cause of the workers. Use your influence, Bakunin, to advise the workers to abstain from elections. Bakunin, I do better than advise you to abstain, I encourage you to fight. Marx, you make them fight with the uncertainty of victory, and it is another type of responsibility. I alluded to your moral errors, one of them is your lack of calm. You take pleasure in the barricade guerrilla warfare even for causes you don't believe in, and this to satisfy your inveterate inclination towards violent action, out of pure excitement. They disdain true political activity because it requires patience, order, and reflection. Bakunin, I dedicate my whole life to political activity. Marx, you dedicate your life to political conspiracy, and it's not the same thing. Bakunin, I spend my whole life among the workers, organization, propaganda, education. Marx, education? For what? Bakunin, for the revolution. I cannot conceive that workers would waste their energy on fallacious representative government-type institutions. Marx, I understand that such ideas may find supporters in Italy and Spain, among lawyers, students, and other intellectuals, but workers will not wish to remain strangers to the political problems of their countries. Telling workers to refrain from politics is to drive them into the arms of priests and bourgeois republicans. Bakunin, my dear Marx, if you read what I wrote, you know that I have always fought vigorously against the Church and the Republicans. Your opinions are much more moderate than mine. Marx, my friend, I never doubted your sincere aversion to priests and Republicans, but you do not understand that, despite your will, you make common cause with them. Bakunin, you're joking, dear Marx. Marx, no, I am serious. Let us examine your propaganda for freedom. It is clear that the only freedom you believe in is individual freedom. In fact, it is the same freedom invoked by bourgeois theorists such as Hobbes, Locke, and Mill. When you think about freedom, you consider that no one should be commanded by anyone. You conceive of each man separately in possession of his own rights threatened by social and collective institutions such as the state. You never manage to think, as every authentic socialist does, about humanity as a whole or about man as a being inseparable from society. Bakunin, once again, Marx, you prove that you didn't listen to me and that you didn't understand what I wanted to tell you. Marx, I believe I understand you better than you understand yourself. By refusing to conceive of the state in any other way than as an instrument of oppression, you demonstrate your inability to conceive of man in any way other than an isolated unit, each with his own will, his own interests and his own desires. This is what the theorists of bourgeois liberal thought believe, and you, anarchists, have the same conception of the human being in society. Your anarchism is pure liberalism taken to the extreme, hysterically taken to the extreme. Your philosophy is essentially selfish. You have a conception of the self, and of the freedom of the self, very close to the metaphysics of capitalism. Bakunin metaphysics doesn't interest me. Marx, however, whichever way you approach it, anarchism leads to metaphysical conclusions. You have the same ethics, very similar to Christian morals, mutual support, we heard you repeat, which, in conventional Christian terms, could be translated as love your neighbor, sacrifice yourself for others. True socialism does not need precepts, since it does not recognize the isolation of the individual. In a socialist society, man cannot be separated from his neighbor or from himself. Bakunin, considering that the state is the cause of this separation, it is clear that there is only one solution: eliminate the state. Marx, but we cannot eliminate it until we have changed the conditions that make the state a necessary excrescence of society. Bakunin, as soon as the workers have enough strength to push it away, the state will cease to be necessary. Marx, so you admit that it is a necessity today? Bakunin, it is necessary for a society based on private property. When private property is distributed by the triumph of socialism. Marx, a socialism concerned with the redistribution of property is an authentic model of vulgarity. Come on, Bakunin, you are not one of those who think that socialism consists of free individual distribution. Bakunin, this is, without a doubt, one of your objectives. Marx, my friend, the aims of socialism are much more radical. He proposes to bring about a complete transformation of human nature, a transformation of the self, the creation of the new man. The individual will merge into society, each being liberated from his own isolation. You say that your goal is freedom. Socialism will give us a freedom, so to speak, unknown in the past experiences of the human species. Bakunin, you make life too mysterious. Marx, and you reduce it to something too small. You contemplate the world, Bakunin, and imagine that a certain part is free and the other oppressed. Bakunin, I don't imagine anything, it's reality. The minority is free, they are the rich. Marx, I must tell you that no one is free in today's world, not even the richest bourgeoisie. Morally speaking, the capitalist, as a man, is as much a slave to the system as the workers are. And this is what allows us to affirm that, in honor of the truth, the emancipation of the proletariat represents the emancipation of the human species. Bakunin, but the substance remains, the rich can do what they please, while the poor lack what is necessary. Marx, however, the choice of the rich is directed and attenuated because of their culture, their bourgeois prejudices and the system that denies the free will of each person. Furthermore, to this is added the petty theory of freedom defined by do as you please. Bakunin, this is always better than the theory defined by do what you must do, which is what the priests say: perfect freedom is to serve the church. Or what Hegel says: perfect freedom is obeying the state. Personally, I prefer the human notion full of freedom that means do what you please. Marx, you define freedom as being the full realization of the possibilities existing in man. This is what is closest to socialism. The socialist being will be free as man is transformed. Bakunin, but if man is not allowed to develop, what is best in him will not be able to manifest itself. Marx, in bourgeois and liberal terms, you are betraying your bourgeois liberal philosophy. But isn't that what Adam Smith and his acolytes say? Leave men to themselves and they will give their best, which is embodied in the famous phrase, let it do. Bakunin, you want to continue to ignore the fact that liberals cling to private property and economic competition, while I maintain, on the contrary, that everything must be put in common. Marx, but if you start from the principle that each man must count on his own precious private right to irreducible freedom, you will come to the conclusion that there will always be people who will want to take something away from the common good, claiming it as if it were theirs. You cannot at the same time have complete individual freedom without claiming individual property. What would they respond to the man who claimed the right to property? And what would they do, devoid of a state or another instrument of socialist authority capable of imposing obedience on the recalcitrant and antisocial? Bakunin, you yourself, Marx, stated that socialist man would be changed, that he would abandon his unnatural selfish impulses and the habits inherited from bourgeois society. Marx, my socialist man will be transformed, Bakunin, but I do not recognize your socialist man at all. You conceive of men as individuals, each one having their own small empire of rights. I, on the contrary, think of humanity as a whole. Freedom, as I understand it, is the liberation of the human species, not the freedom of the individual. Bakunin, it is once again Hegel's point of view on freedom. Acting freely means acting morally, and acting morally means acting in accordance with the reason of state. Marx Hegel was not mistaken. Only a rational being can be free, because only a rational being is in a position to decide when faced with an alternative. An irrational choice is not a free decision. To act freely is to act rationally, and to act rationally implies knowledge of the needs of nature and history. There is, in truth, no antithesis between necessity and freedom. Bakunin, we are not discussing free will, Marx, we talk about political freedom. There are no metaphysical complications in this. Political freedom depends on the suppression of political oppression, and it is not necessary to be initiated into philosophy to see this evidence. A 9-year-old can observe the world and discern the oppressor from the oppressed. Marx and a 9-year-old child could also assume that the situation would not be resolved abruptly by suppressing the state. She could also convert to anarchism, however, considering her age, she would easily forgive herself this madness. Bakunin, there is a philosophical madness as well as a childish madness. All your abstract reasoning about freedom can only lead to the point where Rousseau and Hegel reached, the conviction that men can be free under imposition. Marx, it's true, we can force men to be free, in the sense that we can force them to act rationally or, in any case, prevent them from acting in an unreasonable way. Bakunin, an imposed freedom is not worthy of the name. Marx, it is reality that matters, not men. Bakunin, well, that's the reality. If you accept forcing men to be free, you necessarily think of two classes of individuals, those who coerce and those who suffer coercion. We are, therefore, faced with the two types of men that make up the supposedly classless society of authoritarian socialism, the leaders and the directed, those who are enthroned at the top and those who are below. Marx, by hypothesis, certain people must be superior to others. Thus, I repeat, a socialist society must be regulated, especially at its beginning. The alternative is this, the Tower of Babel, a world in which no one knows what they should do or expect, a world without order and security, or else, confidence in a stable order. Anarchy means chaos, and chaos scares me. If chaos attracts you, it's because you're sensitive to the luxurious charm of bohemian life. After the rigidity of your life during your youth, within a privileged family and in military schools, we understand that disorder seems attractive to you. Bakunin, you speak, Marx, of vulgar socialism, but you yourself have a vulgar notion of what anarchism is. For unprepared minds, the word anarchy means precisely chaos and disorder, but an educated man must know that this word is a phonetic translation of the Greek which simply means opposition to the government. Believing that the absence of government means chaos and disorder is pure superstition. The most ordered nations in Europe today are not those where the government acts most forcefully towards citizens. On the contrary, they are those where this coercion is minimal. I don't understand what you mean when you talk about life as a bohemian. I am in no way attracted to disorder. Marx, you speak vehemently of blood, fire, destruction. Bakunin, pure zeal for battle. I am, perhaps, more impatient than you for the advent of revolution. However, I assure you that anarchists ardently desire, like you, for a socialist order to be established. Marx, such a desire is superfluous, because outside the state there will be no order. Your revolution will only bring us massacres and ruins, nothing more. Bakunin and your kind of revolution, Marx, will leave us something much worse, slavery. Marx, well, my friend, I think it is good that we are both persecuted by the bourgeoisie, otherwise, by prolonging this discussion, you and I could cease to be socialists. Bakunin, I'll get some hot water. The tea got cold. The curious are warned that, ...